chapter now, and some really interesting questions are raised about what will happen at resurrection and what will we be like. And I've got a lot of great deep questions about that myself, but let's look at see what Paul says about resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, starting in verse 35 to verse 49. But some will ask, how were the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body as he has determined, and to each kind of seed he gives its own body. Not all flesh is the same. People have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds another, and fish another. There are also heavenly bodies, and there are earthly bodies, but the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, and the splendor of earthly bodies is another. The sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, the stars another, and the stars differ from star in splendor. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being, the last Adam, a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that, the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth. The second man is of heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth. And as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are of heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man. So Paul again is addressing more objections to the idea of resurrection. It's similar to the kinds of objections that Jesus addresses with the Pharisees in the Gospels. With the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a group who did not believe in resurrection, and they have these theological, philosophical objections to resurrection, and Jesus responds to those objections in the Gospels. Paul is responding to similar kinds of objections, so it seems that there's this debate in the church that's similar to the debate between the Pharisees and the Sadducees about the rationality of resurrection. And Paul here is responding to the objections that have to do with what kind of body would we have? And to be honest, those are some great questions. I mean, I want to know, will our resurrected bodies have hair and fingernails, and will they grow, and will we need to clip them? Will our resurrected bodies have to use the bathroom? How old will our resurrected bodies be, and will they age at all, or will they just constantly stay the same? We don't know. There's all kinds of questions that resurrection raises about our bodies and the kind of people we will be. But Paul's basic argument here in the chapter is that our resurrected bodies will be physical bodies. They will be physical. We will have actual bodies, but they will be of a different kind of substance, a different kind of class of bodies. So Paul makes this reference to heavenly bodies and earthly bodies and different kinds of splendor, and it's the kind of language that would have been used in the first century to describe cosmology, the way that the first century philosophers understood the heavens, the planets, the stars, the sun and the moon, and that these were classified in different categories of substance. And it's not the kind of language we would use for cosmology today, but it's out of that Paul makes this analogy that in the same way that there's different classes of substance, there are different kinds of bodies. So we will have a transformed kind of body. It'll be physical, but it'll be a totally different kind of body, one that is transformed. We will be, Paul says, more perfectly transformed into the image of Christ. That's a transformation that has already begun in this life. That's a point that Paul has made several times here in 1 Corinthians, that in a spiritual sense, we are already moving toward the image of Christ, and at the resurrection, we will be even physically transformed toward the image of Christ. And when I first started talking about resurrection in our Lent devotions, I mentioned our sourdough starter. This is some of it right now. It's multiplied and it grows all the time, and we feed it every day. It's just yeast and flour and water. We just added flour and water. The yeast in the atmosphere just started doing its work, fermenting inside and growing, and then out of that we have learned to make sourdough bread. So this is today's sourdough bread. It's pretty great stuff. We're still learning how to do it, still perfecting our recipe, but it's making really great bread. This sourdough starter, flour and water, is being transformed into some pretty great bread. And there's a similar kind of transformation that will happen, that there's a fermentation at work in my life, and God is putting these pieces together, and he's going to make something brand new out of it. In fact, that's one of my questions is will we be able to eat good food in the resurrection? It seems like yes, because Jesus makes a reference to eating, and his resurrected body eats. I'm looking forward to having some pretty great sourdough bread in the resurrection.